Did you know that the bullying you suffered as a child can still control your adult life? There is a question that many people carry in silence: why do some people seem to attract rejection from an early age? At school, they became the butt of jokes. In groups, they are ignored. And even as they grow up, they still feel that strange need for approval, as if they're always trying to prove that they deserve to be there. The truth is that the impact of bullying in adult life almost never starts only in the schoolyard. It often has deep roots in a loveless childhood, in experiences of rejection, or in moments when the child felt invisible. Gradually, this builds low self-esteem and a silent psychological pattern. The person learns to seek value outside of themselves, developing an external self-worth, dependent on the acceptance of others. This is where a behavior that many people know well comes in: the famous people-pleasing, that tendency to please everyone, avoid conflicts and adapt all the time. It seems like kindness, but often it's just an unconscious strategy to avoid further rejection. Behind this there may be a childhood trauma, a constant attempt to make up for something that was missing back then. But hey, the most important and perhaps the most liberating part: what's been learned can also be unlearned. Understanding the psychology of bullying, the psychology of rejection, and the effects of learned helplessness is the first step to starting a true emotional healing of childhood. And that's exactly what we're going to explore together. Throughout this content, you will understand how these experiences shape identity, relationships, and even life choices, and, more importantly, how to rebuild your own story from now on. Many people believe that emotional wounds begin in adolescence or school, but most of the time, they begin much earlier. A childhood without love or marked by emotional coldness can leave deep marks on the way the child perceives himself in the world. When the father figure is distant, critical, or indifferent, the child tries to understand the reason. And she almost always comes to the wrong conclusion: the problem must be with me. Within the psychology of rejection, there is a very common pattern. The child interprets the absence of affection as proof that he is not worthy of love. This is how low self-esteem arises in the first years of life. Gradually, he turns into an emotionally neglected child, even if he has a home, school, and food. What is missing is not structure, it is emotional validation. This type of childhood trauma doesn't usually make noise, but it profoundly shapes the personality. The child begins to observe the adults around him, trying to figure out how to gain attention and approval. Without realizing it, she begins to believe that love needs to be earned, deserved, proven. And it is exactly at this point that something silent but powerful is born: the future need for approval. When a child grows up dealing with rejection or emotional coldness, they begin to make small, silent promises to themselves. Something like, if I behave right, maybe he'll finally like you. This thought seems innocent, but that's when a strong need for approval begins to be born. The child learns that being accepted depends on how much he can please. In practice, this shapes behavior in a profound way. The child observes everything around him and tries to adapt. He talks less so as not to bother, agrees more to avoid conflict, and does everything not to disappoint. This pattern, which will later be known as people-pleasing, is often born precisely from a loveless childhood or an ongoing experience of emotional rejection. Over time, the infant brain begins to associate love with performance. If she gets good grades, helps adults, or behaves in an exemplary manner, she may receive a little attention. Thus begins to form a dangerous psychological pattern called externalized self-worth, where one's worth depends completely on the approval of others. And when this pattern meets the social environment of the school, a new chapter of this story begins to emerge. When the child arrives at school carrying this need for approval, he does not realize that he is entering a social environment full of invisible hierarchies. While some children feel safe to express themselves, those who grew up in a loveless childhood often arrive trying only one thing: to be accepted. She observes the behavior of her colleagues, adapts her personality, and does everything not to be rejected. In practice, this appears in small gestures. The child laughs at jokes even when he is not amused, agrees with everything others say, and avoids defending his own opinions. Gradually, this attitude reinforces a low self-esteem, because she learns that her ideas and desires always come after others. It is as if he is constantly asking for permission to exist within the group. It is exactly at this point that the psychology of bullying begins to manifest itself more strongly. Children with emotional insecurity often convey subtle signs of vulnerability, withdrawnness, difficulty setting boundaries, and constant fear of disapproval. Unfortunately, some colleagues quickly realize this. And what started as a simple search for acceptance can end up opening the door to profound experiences of rejection and humiliation. After a few experiences of rejection or bullying, the child's mind begins to create survival strategies. One of the most common is simple: avoid anything that could generate conflict. It is at this moment that the behavior known as people-pleasing begins to emerge, the tendency to please everyone to keep the peace. For those who grew up with low self-esteem and fear of rejection, this seems almost like an automatic mechanism. On a daily basis, this behavior appears in various forms. The child starts to apologize even when he has done nothing, accepts uncomfortable games just so as not to seem boring, and does favors all the time to try to keep others around. Within the psychology of rejection, this happens because the brain associates acceptance with emotional security. To a neglected child, any sign of approval can seem extremely valuable. The problem is that, little by little, this strategy creates a dangerous pattern. The person begins to believe that they need to annul themselves to be accepted. Their value comes to depend exclusively on the reaction of others, further reinforcing their external self-worth. This pattern, which is born as a defense against childhood trauma, ends up preparing the ground for something that often accompanies this story: becoming an easy target within the dynamics of bullying. There is something that the psychology of bullying observes all too often: bullies tend to choose targets that show signs of emotional vulnerability. Children who grew up in a loveless childhood or who were neglected children often carry this vulnerability without realizing it. The more withdrawn posture, the fear of confrontation, and the constant need for approval end up working as silent signs for those looking for someone easier to intimidate. In the school environment, this manifests itself in a subtle way in the beginning. Small teasing, disguised jokes, or exclusions from the group begin to happen. The child, already accustomed to the psychology of rejection, often interprets these situations as something he needs to endure in order to continue belonging to the group. Instead of reacting, it tries to adapt even more, reinforcing the behavior of people-pleasing. This cycle ends up feeding a bigger problem. The more the child tries to please and avoid conflict, the more the aggressors realize that there will be no resistance. The result is that childhood trauma begins to deepen, reinforcing low self-esteem and setting the stage for an even more complex psychological mechanism that can emerge as a survival response. When a child spends a lot of time dealing with rejection, criticism, or bullying, the brain begins to look for ways to survive emotionally. One of these strategies is known in psychology as the fawn response. Instead of fighting or fleeing, the child tries to please those who threaten him. It seems strange at first glance, but for those who have experienced childhood trauma, this may seem like the safest way to avoid further pain. In practice, this response manifests itself as an intensification of people-pleasing. The child starts to anticipate the needs of others, agrees with everything, and does everything not to provoke irritation or rejection. For those who grew up as a neglected child, pleasing may seem like the only possible way to receive some kind of acceptance. The brain learns that keeping others happy can mean maintaining one's own emotional security. The problem is that, over time, this strategy further reinforces external self-worth. the person begins to believe that his worth depends solely on the satisfaction of others. This strengthens low self-esteem and deepens the effects of rejection psychology. Without realizing it, the child loses contact with his own desires, preparing the ground for a psychological pattern that can accompany him for many years. Over time, the child who has lived through the psychology of bullying and grew up in a loveless childhood begins to build a very specific way of seeing himself. Instead of feeling value simply for existing, they start to measure their value by the reaction of the people around them. If someone compliments her, she feels good. If someone criticizes or rejects, the world seems to collapse. This is how the so-called externalized self-worth is born. In practice, this means living in constant emotional vigilance. The person observes facial expressions, tones of voice, and small changes in behavior to find out if they are still being accepted. For someone who was a neglected child and developed low self-esteem, every gesture of others feels like a verdict on their personal worth. It is as if life were a permanent test of approval. The problem is that this pattern creates a deep emotional dependence. The person starts to shape their choices, opinions, and even their personality to avoid rejection. This behavior connects directly with people-pleasing, reinforcing the need for approval. And when this logic is repeated for years, it can lead to an even quieter and more dangerous psychological state: the feeling that nothing you do really changes reality itself. When experiences of rejection, neglect, and bullying are repeated for a long time, the brain begins to draw a dangerous conclusion: there's no point in trying. This phenomenon is known in psychology as learned helplessness. After so many unsuccessful attempts to be accepted, the person begins to believe that he has no control over his own life. In practice, this can show up in very subtle ways. The person avoids taking a stand, lets opportunities pass by, and often remains in uncomfortable situations because they believe that nothing will change. For someone who grew up dealing with childhood trauma, the psychology of rejection, and low self-esteem, the brain learns that pushing yourself emotionally can be too risky. This psychological state further reinforces the cycle of external self-worth. If the value depends on others and others always seem to reject or criticize, then the person begins to accept any crumb of approval. This is how the impact of bullying in adult life begins to become more visible, shaping choices, relationships, and even the way someone sees their own future. When someone grows up facing bullying psychology, constant rejection, and a loveless childhood, those experiences don't get stuck in the past. They end up silently infiltrating the way the person constructs their identity. Often, the adult starts to define himself through the wounds he carried, keeping his self-esteem low and the feeling that he always needs to prove his worth. This shows up in very common thoughts: I'm not good enough, no one will really like me, or if I show who I really am, they'll reject me. These thoughts are echoes of an old childhood trauma and the psychology of rejection experienced in childhood. For those who were neglected children, this worldview can seem so natural that the person does not even realize that they are living within a narrative created by pain. Over the years, this identity based on insecurity further reinforces external self-worth. The adult continues to seek validation from bosses, friends, partners, and even strangers. Without realizing it, he carries into adulthood the same patterns that emerged in childhood. And that paves the way for something that many people recognize too late: the repetition of these patterns in virtually every relationship in life. When someone grows up with low self-esteem, marked by childhood trauma and the psychology of rejection, there is a high chance that these patterns will be repeated in adulthood. Without realizing it, the person tends to approach environments and relationships that reinforce what he learned in childhood. It is as if the brain seeks out what is familiar, even when that familiar is unhealthy. In friendships, for example, this can appear when the person always takes on the role of helping, listening, and solving problems but is rarely really heard. At work, they may take on too many tasks, avoid saying no, and have difficulty setting boundaries. This behavior is deeply linked to people-pleasing and external self-worth, where the feeling of value constantly depends on the approval of others. In love relationships, this pattern can become even more intense. The person may tolerate disrespect, fear of abandonment, or unbalanced relationships just so as not to relive that old feeling of rejection. The impact of bullying in adult life appears precisely here. The person continues to try to win love in the same way he tried in childhood. But at some point a powerful question arises: what if it's possible to live in a different way? The good news is that the patterns created by a loveless childhood trauma, or the psychology of bullying don't have to define the rest of life. The first step in emotional childhood healing begins with something simple but powerful: realizing that many current behaviors have been survival strategies. People-pleasing, for example, was not born out of weakness, it was born as an attempt to avoid pain. A very useful practice in this process is to start reconnecting with your own desires. Simple questions can open important doors. What do I really like? What would I do if I wasn't afraid of disapproval? For those who have spent years living through external self-worth, these questions may seem strange at first. But this is precisely how the person begins to rebuild an identity that no longer depends on the approval of others. Some practical tools help a lot on this path. Therapy, reflective writing, or reading about human behavior can accelerate this process of self-knowledge. Books such as The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, by Nathaniel Branden, for example, help to understand how to rebuild low self-esteem over time. And as this awareness grows, something begins to change silently. The person realizes that he can, little by little, begin to live more authentically. Over time, as a person progresses in the emotional healing of childhood, something begins to change in a profound way. That old need for approval begins to lose strength, and a new realization emerges: personal value no longer needs to come from the validation of others. After years of living through external self-worth, discovering that value can come from within is almost like learning a new emotional language. This process also involves something that many people who have experienced childhood trauma need to learn: little by little setting limits. Saying no, expressing opinions, and not accepting disrespect can feel uncomfortable at first. But each small limit placed helps to rebuild a self-esteem that was previously weakened by the psychology of rejection and the impact of bullying in adult life. Over time, the person stops living only reacting to the expectations of others and begins to build a life more aligned with who they really are. The old pattern of people-pleasing gives way to authenticity, and that child who once felt invisible finally begins to occupy his own space in the world. And when that happens, a new story begins to be written. If you've come this far, you may have recognized yourself in several parts of this story. Perhaps you have also realized that many behaviors that today seem like weakness, such as the need for approval, people-pleasing, or the difficulty in imposing limits, were actually born as survival strategies. They were responses to a loveless childhood, to experiences of the psychology of rejection, and to the profound impact of bullying in adulthood. But now comes the most important question of all: how long will these past experiences continue to decide who you are today? Does that neglected child still need to command the choices of his adult life? Or could this be the time to start a true emotional healing of childhood, rebuilding your self-esteem and no longer depending on external self-worth to feel enough? The truth is that understanding these dynamics is already a giant step. When you begin to see the effects of childhood trauma and learned helplessness, something powerful happens. You stop blaming yourself and start understanding yourself. And from this understanding is born the real possibility of change. Now I want to ask you a few questions. You're living the life you really want? Or are you still trying to please everyone? You make decisions based on how you feel, or in the fear of disapproving someone. What if today was the first step in building an identity based on authenticity and self-love? If this content made sense to you, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. That way, you don't miss the next videos on psychology, human behavior, and personal development that can help you better understand your own story and, who knows, transform it.